My son handed his in-laws the keys to a brand new BMW with a bright red bow on Christmas Eve, while the whole family cheered and cameras flashed and champagne glasses clinked together in celebration. Then he turned to me, his own father, the man who worked double shifts for 30 years to put him through college, and handed me a small box wrapped in newspaper. Inside was a pair of socks from the dollar store. Still with the $2 price tag attached, the room went quiet. My daughter-in-law smiled at her mother and whispered something that made them both laugh. And my son? My only child looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Everyone gets what they deserve, Dad." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't say a single word. I just folded those cheap socks, put them in my pocket, and smiled back at him. Because what none of them knew was that my late wife had seen this coming years before she died. She left me something hidden in a place only I would find waiting for exactly this moment. So at 4 a.m, while they slept off their champagne, I packed one small bag and walked out into the snow. But before I left, I placed one final gift under their Christmas tree. By the time they woke up, that gift had already started a chain of events that would cost them everything they thought they owned. Stay with me until the very end of this story, because what my wife planned from beyond the grave and what my own daughter-in-law's mother revealed will leave you speechless. My name is Arthur Bennett, and I spent 40 years as a structural engineer building bridges and highways across 3 states before retirement. My wife Margaret passed away 3 years ago, leaving me with a small cabin by the lake where we honeymooned a lifetime of memories and one son who I believed would always be my greatest achievement. I arrived at Andrew's house on Christmas Eve carrying 4 carefully wrapped gifts in a canvas bag, the same bag Margaret used to pack for our holiday visits when she was alive. The snow had been falling since morning, covering the suburban streets in white, and I remember thinking how beautiful the neighborhood looked with all the lights and decorations. Andrew and Lauren's house was the largest on the block, a 4-bedroom colonial with a 3-car garage that I helped them with the down payment on 7 years ago. I never asked for the money back. That was what fathers did. I believe they gave without keeping score. Lauren opened the door wearing a red dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She smiled the way she always smiled at me, with her lips, but never quite with her eyes. "Dad, you made it," she said, taking my coat without offering a hug. Everyone's already in the living room. We were just about to start the gift exchange. The living room was full of people I barely knew. Lauren's parents sat on the main couch like royalty, holding court. Her mother in pearls and her father in a sweater that looked deliberately casual in the way expensive things often do. Lauren's sister and her husband occupied the love seat, their twin daughters playing with a tablet on the floor, and there was Andrew, my son, standing by the fireplace with a glass of wine, looking everywhere except at me. "Arthur, good to see you," Lauren's father said. Without standing up, he never stood up when I entered a room. I had noticed that years ago and trained myself not to care. I placed my gifts under the tree and found a chair in the corner, the only seat left available. The conversation continued around me as if I had not arrived. Discussions about vacation plans and stock portfolios and a ski trip someone was organizing for February. I listened and nodded when appropriate, the way I had learned to do at these gatherings since Margaret died. She had always been my translator in social situations, the one who knew how to turn my quiet nature into something charming rather than awkward without her. I often felt like a foreign visitor who had lost his phrase book. "Okay, everyone, it's time for the main event," Lauren announced, clapping her hands together. She walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. With theatrical flourish, outside, parked in the driveway, with a massive red bow on its hood, sat a white BMW sedan gleaming under the porch lights. Lauren's mother gasped, Her father stood up for the first time all evening. "Merry Christmas," Mom and Dad Lauren said, her voice trembling with rehearsed emotion. "Andrew and I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for us. This is just a small token of our appreciation." The room erupted in applause and tears and embraces. I watched my son shake his father-in-law's hand and receive a hug from his mother-in-law, his face bright with pride at having orchestrated such a moment. The BMW must have cost at least $60. Malazero. I did not know my son had that kind of money. Then again, I realized I did not know very much about my son's life anymore. After the celebration settled, Lauren began distributing the remaining gifts I received, mine last. It was a small box wrapped in plain paper, no ribbon, no tag, with a personal message. I opened it carefully. While the room watched, inside was a pair of gray socks from a discount store. The price sticker was still attached to the plastic wrapper. $2. The room went silent. I stared at the socks for a long moment, unsure if this was a joke I was supposed to laugh at. When I looked up, Andrew was studying his wine glass, as if it contained something fascinating. He would not meet my eyes. "We thought you'd appreciate something practical," Dad Lauren said with a smile that carried no warmth. "You're always saying you don't need anything fancy." I nodded slowly, folding the socks and placing them back in the box. "Thank you," I said, because Margaret had raised me to be gracious even when graciousness was not deserved. Very thoughtful. As I sat there holding my $2 gift, I heard Margaret's voice in my memory, something she told me during her final weeks when the medication made her speak truths. She had always kept gentle watch, how people treat you when they think you have nothing left to give. She had said that's when you'll see who they really are. Lauren leaned toward her mother and whispered something that made them both laugh. I could not hear the words, but I recognized the look on their faces. It was the same look people give to things they are about to throw away. Dinner was served shortly after the gift exchange, and I took my seat at the far end of the table where a place card with my name had been positioned next to the kitchen doorway. Lauren's parents sat at the head of the table, still glowing from their BMW surprise, while Andrew and Lauren flanked them like attendants to minor royalty. The conversation flowed around me in currents I could not quite enter. Discussions about investment properties and country club memberships, and a renovation Lauren was planning for the master bathroom that would cost more than my first house. I ate quietly and complimented the food when appropriate, trying to remember the last time Andrew had called me just to talk, not to ask for something, or to cancel plans we had made. It had been months, I realized maybe longer, since Margaret died. The phone calls had grown shorter and further apart, until they became almost ceremonial brief check-ins that felt more like obligations than connections after the plates were cleared. We moved back to the living room for coffee and dessert. I was settling into my corner chair when Lauren's voice rose above the general conversation, directed at no one in particular, but clearly meant for everyone to hear. "You know what I admire most about my parents," she said, gesturing toward her mother and father with her wine glass. "They understood that working smart matters more than just working. So many people spend their whole lives grinding away at jobs that go nowhere, living in the same small houses, never taking risks or thinking bigger. But Mom and Dad knew how to leverage opportunities, how to make their money work for them instead of the other way around." She glanced at me as she said this, just briefly, just long enough to make sure I understood who she was. Really talking about, her mother nodded in agreement, and her father raised his glass in a small toast to himself. I felt my jaw tighten but said nothing. 40 years, I had worked as an engineer designing structures that would outlast everyone in this room. I had never chased wealth or status, but I had built things that mattered, things that helped people get where they needed to go safely. Margaret had always said that was worth more than any stock portfolio, but Margaret was not here to say it now. "Lauren's right," Andrew added, and something in my chest turned cold at the sound of my son's voice joining hers. "There's nothing wrong with being practical and modest dad. But times have changed. You can't just put your head down and expect life to reward you for effort alone. You have to be strategic. You have to position yourself. I looked at my son, searching for some trace of the boy I had raised, the one who used to sit on my lap, while I explained how bridges distributed weight and why certain designs lasted centuries while others crumbled. That boy had been curious and kind and full of questions. This man standing before me with his wine glass and his rehearsed philosophy seemed like a stranger wearing my son's face. "I did all right," I said quietly. "Your mother and I were happy we had enough." Andrew exchanged a glance with Lauren, the kind of glance married couples share when they are both thinking the same uncharitable thought. Then he set down his glass and looked at me with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "Everyone gets what they deserve." "Dad," he said, "that's just how life works. Some people end up with BMWs, and some people end up with socks. It's not personal. It's just the way things shake out based on the choices you make." The room was silent for a moment, and I understood then that my son was not trying to hurt me. He genuinely believed what he was saying. Lauren had spent years reshaping his thinking, and now he saw the world through her eyes, without even realizing the prescription had changed. I was not his father in this room. I was a cautionary tale, an example of what happened to people who did not play the game correctly. I excused myself shortly after claiming tiredness from the drive. No one protested. Lauren pointed me toward the guest room at the end of the hall, a small space with a single bed and bare walls that felt more like a storage closet than a place meant for family. I closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of the mattress, listening to the muffled laughter from the living room. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached for my wallet inside tucked. Behind my driver's license was a small photograph of Margaret that I carried everywhere it was taken on our 30th anniversary, her hair silver and her smile radiant. Standing on the porch of our cabin by the lake, I turned it over and read the words she had written on the back in her careful handwriting. Words I'd read 100 times before but never fully understood. "Protect your dignity, I'll handle the rest." She had written those words 3 years ago, just weeks before she died. The cancer had spread to her bones by then, and the medication made her say things that seemed to come from somewhere beyond ordinary conversation. At the time, I thought she meant it as comfort, a dying wife's reassurance that everything would be fine. I smiled and kissed her forehead and told her not to worry about me now, lying awake in my son's guest room with cheap socks in my pocket and my son's words echoing in my ears. I wondered if it had been something else entirely. Margaret had always seen further than I could. She noticed things about people that took me years to recognize. She had watched Lauren from the very beginning, with careful eyes, never saying anything directly, but never quite warming to her either. I stared at her handwriting for a long time, tracing the loops of her letters with my thumb. "Protect your dignity, I'll handle the rest." It didn't sound like comfort anymore. It sounded like a promise. Sleep would not come. I lay in the darkness for what felt like hours, listening to the house settle around me and the distant murmur of voices from the living room that gradually faded as the other guests departed. Eventually, I heard footsteps in the hallway doors, closing the creak of stairs. As Andrew and Lauren retired to their bedroom on the upper floor, the house fell silent, but my mind refused to quiet itself. Around 2 a.m, I gave up trying to rest and slipped out of the guest room. The hallway was dark, except for a nightlight near the bathroom, casting just enough glow for me to navigate. Without turning on the overhead lights, I told myself I was looking for a glass of water, but something else pulled me forward, a restlessness I could not name. I passed Andrew's home office on my way to the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar, and moonlight from the window inside created a pale rectangle on the hallway carpet. I hesitated, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room smelled of leather, an expensive cologne decorated with the kind of modern furniture that prioritizes appearance over comfort. Andrew's desk sat beneath the window, covered with papers and folders that had been pushed aside to make room for a laptop I should not have looked. I knew that even as my hands reached for the documents stacked in a wire tray beside the computer. But something about this night had stripped away my usual deference, my habit of respecting boundaries that others never respected with me. I picked up the first folder and angled it toward the Moonlight Mortgage Statement's car loan documents. Credit card bills with balances that made my chest tighten. Andrew and Lauren were not as wealthy as they pretended to be. I realized they were leveraged to the edge of disaster, maintaining their lifestyle through a web of debt that would take decades to untangle. The BMW in the driveway suddenly looked less like generosity and more like performance, an expensive prop in a play about success. But it was the address on the mortgage statement that stopped my breath. The house was not listed under Andrew's name. It was registered to something called the Margaret Ellis Bennett Family Trust, with a notation indicating a nominal lease arrangement of $1 per year. I read the line 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. This house, the one Andrew and Lauren treated as their own, the one they filled with expensive furniture and hosted dinner parties, and as though they had built it themselves, still belonged to Margaret's family. Trust, they did not own it at all. The memory surfaced, slowly rising. From somewhere I had buried it years ago. It was just after Andrew announced his engagement to Lauren, and I had suggested to Margaret that we transfer the house to him as a wedding present. We had purchased it as an investment property years earlier, planning to give it to Andrew when he started his own family. The timing seemed perfect, but Margaret had refused. She sat at our kitchen table with her reading glasses perched on her nose, looking at me over the documents I had prepared with an expression I could not quite interpret. "Not yet," she said firmly. "Let them earn it first when I see that they understand what this family really means. We can talk about transferring the deed." I had argued with her gently, the way we always argued. I said she was being too cautious, too protective, that Andrew was a grown man who deserved our trust. Margaret listened to everything I said, then shook her head and gathered up the papers. "Trust is earned, Arthur, even from family, especially from family I never brought it up again." And after she died, I assumed the transfer had simply been forgotten in the chaos of grief and legal proceedings I never thought to check. I never imagined Margaret had kept the house in her trust deliberately, a decision that now seemed less like caution and more like prophecy. Another memory followed the first 6 months before the cancer took her. Margaret had spent an afternoon with Evelyn Brooks, a former colleague from her days working in hospital administration, who had gone on to become an estate attorney. When Margaret came home that evening, I asked what they had discussed. She kissed my cheek and smiled in that mysterious way. She had the one that meant she was keeping something to herself for my own good. "Insurance, darling." She said, "Just insurance." I had not thought about that conversation in years. Now it felt like a message I had failed to decode. I left the office and continued down the hallway. My bare feet silent on the hardwood floors near the back of the house, I found a small closet I had not noticed before tucked beneath the staircase inside. Behind winter coats and forgotten umbrellas sat a cardboard box labeled Margaret's Things in Andrew's handwriting. I pulled the box into the hallway and knelt beside it. My heart beating faster than it should inside were items I recognized from our home things Andrew must have taken after the funeral. Margaret's reading glasses, a few of her favorite books, some photographs from our travels together, and at the bottom beneath everything else, a sealed envelope made of heavy, cream-colored paper. My name was written across the front. In Margaret's handwriting, below it in smaller letters, she had added for Arthur. When you're ready, I held the envelope up to the moonlight streaming through the window. At the end of the hall, it was thick, heavier than a simple letter would be. Something else was inside, documents perhaps, or photographs. My fingers trembled as I traced the familiar loops of her script, the way she always wrote my Name with a slight flourish on the final letter. Whatever Margaret had left me, she had meant for me to find it at exactly this moment. Not before, when grief might have clouded my judgment. Not later, when the evidence of my son's transformation might have faded now on this Christmas Eve in this house that still secretly belonged to her, with her words about dignity echoing in my memory. I did not open the envelope that night. Something told me the moment was not right, that Margaret had intended for me to read whatever was inside when I had clarity and distance, not while standing in my son's hallway with my heart pounding and my hands unsteady. I returned to the guest room and placed the envelope in my coat pocket, then lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled me under. I woke at 4 in the morning on December 26th with a strange calm settling over me. The house was completely silent, that deep winter quiet that feels almost sacred, and I knew immediately. What I needed to do, there was no debate in my mind, no weighing of options or second-guessing the decision had been made somewhere in my sleep, or perhaps it had been made years ago by Margaret, and I was only now catching up to her wisdom. I dressed quietly in the darkness, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent decades waking before dawn for job sites and early meetings. My suitcase was small, just large enough for a few changes of clothes and some toiletries. I added my important documents. The envelope from Margaret still sealed, and one other item I had brought with me from home. The original velvet box containing Margaret's wedding ring. She had asked me to keep it after she died, not to bury it with her or lock it away in a safe deposit box. It should stay in the family, she had said during one of our last conversations, when the morphine made her words slow, but her meaning clear. Give it to someone who understands what it represents, someone who earns it. I had assumed she meant Andrew would give it to his future daughter someday, or perhaps to Lauren as a gesture of family acceptance. Now I understood differently. The ring was a test, just like the house. Just like everything Margaret had arranged with her. Quiet foresight. She had left me the tools to measure my son's character. The results were not what either of us had hoped. I carried my suitcase to the living room and placed the ring box beneath the Christmas tree, nestled among the discarded wrapping paper and empty gift boxes that no one had bothered to clean up. I attached a small tag I had written in the guest room, using a pen from Andrew's desk and a scrap of paper torn from a notepad. The message was simple for Andrew. Your mother wanted you to understand. He would not understand, of course, not yet, but someday. When he learned the full truth about what Margaret had arranged, he might remember this moment and realize that I had given him a chance. The ring was not a gift. It was an invitation to become worthy of his inheritance. What he did with that invitation was no longer my responsibility. I was heading toward the front door when I heard a voice from upstairs. Lauren's voice, muffled but distinct in the silence of the sleeping house. She was talking on the phone, which struck me as odd given the hour. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, not intending to eavesdrop, but unable to move forward once her words reached my ears. Don't worry, Mom, she was saying, her tone casual and confident. Nothing like the performative sweetness she used in my presence. The old man won't last much longer anyway. Then everything becomes simpler. Andrew's already got him convinced he's just a burden, another year or two. And he'll probably sign over whatever's left just to make things easier on everyone. We just have to be patient. I stood frozen in the darkness, listening to my daughter-in-law discuss my irrelevance as though she were planning a minor home renovation. Her voice carried no malice, which somehow made it worse. I was not an enemy to her, not someone she hated or feared. I was simply an obstacle, a temporary inconvenience standing between her and whatever she believed she deserved. She laughed at something her mother said, and the sound broke whatever spell had held me in place. I turned away from the stairs and walked to the front door, stepping out into the December cold. Without looking back, the snow had stopped falling sometime in the night, leaving the world covered in a pristine white blanket that sparkled under the streetlights. My car was parked at the curb, already dusted with frost, and I brushed the windows clear with my bare hands before climbing inside the engine. Started on the first try, and I pulled away from Andrew's house with my headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. I didn't honk or flash my lights or do anything to announce my departure. There was no drama in leaving, no grand gesture of wounded pride. I simply drove away, heading north toward the lake, toward the cabin where Margaret and I had spent our honeymoon 44 years ago. The winter sun was just beginning to rise as I pulled onto the highway, painting the horizon in shades of pink and gold that Margaret would have loved in my rear-view mirror. My son's house grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely behind a curve in the road. I expected to feel sadness or anger or the sharp ache of loss that had accompanied me since Margaret's death. Instead, I felt something I had not experienced in years, something I barely recognized at first, because it had been absent for so long. I felt free, not happy, not vindicated, not at peace, just free in the way a man feels when he finally stops carrying a weight he did not realize was crushing him. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and waiting. And for the first time since Margaret died, I was not dreading what came next. I learned later what happened that morning at Andrew's house, pieced together from phone calls and conversations that would follow in the weeks ahead. But even driving north toward the cabin, I could imagine the scene unfolding behind me with perfect clarity. I knew my son. I knew his wife. And I knew exactly how they would react when they discovered I was gone. Andrew woke around 9 later than usual, still sluggish from the wine he had consumed the night before. He shuffled downstairs expecting to find me in the kitchen making coffee, the way I always did when I visited, keeping myself useful, trying not to be a burden. Instead, he found the coffee pot cold and the guest room door standing open. The bed was made with military precision, the way Margaret had taught me decades ago. My coat was gone from the closet, my shoes were missing from the mat by the door. Andrew stood in the empty room for a long moment, processing what he was seeing, before Lauren's voice called from the living room. "Where's your father? He hasn't started breakfast yet." Andrew walked back to find his wife standing by the Christmas tree in her silk robe, arms crossed, surveying the mess of wrapping paper and empty boxes with visible annoyance when he told her the guest room was empty. Her reaction was not concern, but irritation, her mouth tightening into a thin line of displeasure. "He's probably sulking somewhere," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You know how he gets. He'll come back when he gets hungry. Old people can't stay dramatic for very long." But Andrew was not listening. His attention had been caught by something beneath the tree, a small velvet box. He did not recognize sitting among the debris of the previous night's celebration. He knelt down and picked it up, turning it over in his hands, before opening the lid. Inside, resting on faded silk, was his mother's wedding ring. I'm told his face went pale when he saw it, the color draining from his cheeks. As though he had seen a ghost, Margaret had worn that ring for 42 years. He had watched me slip it off her finger at the funeral home, had seen me tuck it into my jacket pocket with trembling hands. And now here it was, left beneath his Christmas tree like an afterthought, like something being returned. Lauren snatched the attached note before Andrew could read it. Her voice dripped with contempt as she read the words aloud for Andrew. "Your mother wanted you to understand." She crumpled the paper and tossed it aside. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Understand what your father is getting senile." "Andrew, this is exactly what I've been telling you. He needs to be in a facility where someone can watch him." Andrew did not respond. He was staring at the ring, turning the box over and over in his hands. Something shifting behind his eyes that might have been memory or might have been the first tremor of fear. Lauren retreated to the kitchen to make her own coffee. Pulling out her phone to call her mother, Patricia answered on the third ring, her voice carrying that particular brightness people use when they are trying to sound normal, Lauren launched into her complaint, immediately describing the dramatic old man who had vanished in the night and left behind cryptic messages like some character in a bad movie. But Patricia's responses were strange. Instead of sympathizing with her daughter's frustration, she kept asking odd questions that seemed disconnected from the conversation. Did Arthur mention anything about the bank? Had he said anything about paperwork or documents? Did Andrew notice if Arthur had been looking through files in the house? Lauren brushed off the questions, too focused on her own grievances to wonder why her mother sounded so uncomfortable. She ended the call with a promise to keep Patricia updated and returned to the living room where Andrew was now pacing with his phone pressed to his ear. He had been calling me for the past 20 minutes. Each attempt went straight to voicemail, my recorded greeting playing over and over like a taunt. I had turned my phone off somewhere around the state line, wanting silence, wanting space to think. Without the electronic tether pulling me back toward a life I was no longer certain I wanted, Andrew's fear was growing with each unanswered call. But it was not the fear a son should feel for a missing father. He was not worried about my safety or my well-being. He was worried about what I might know. What I might have seen during my restless wandering through his house the night before the mortgage documents, the trust name on the deed, the careful architecture of deception that Lauren had convinced him was necessary and normal that evening, as Lauren poured herself a third glass of wine and complained about how I had ruined their Christmas with my theatrics. Her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen, casually expecting a social media alert or a message from a friend. Instead, she saw a reminder from the bank. Your vehicle loan payment of $2,800 and Morrison is due in 5 days? She stared at the words for a long moment, the wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. That payment was for the BMW, the gleaming white symbol of generosity she had presented to her parents just 2 days before the loan she had arranged with Andrew's signature, counting on certain financial arrangements to cover the monthly burden Arthur was supposed to handle that she thought Arthur always covered everything. He was the safety net, the backup plan, the reliable old man who paid for things without asking questions because he wanted to be useful, wanted to feel needed, wanted to believe his son still loved him, but Arthur was gone now. And for the first time, Lauren wondered if he had taken more than just his suitcase. When he left, what happened next in that house, I would learn about only later when the full story began to emerge from the wreckage of secrets Margaret had so carefully constructed, but I can tell it now, as though I had been standing in the corner watching, because Andrew eventually confessed every detail during one of our conversations in the months that followed, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had discovered about his mother, his wife, and himself. It was 2 days after I left when Andrew finally looked at the ring box again. Lauren had dismissed it as sentimental nonsense, the ramblings of a grieving widow preserved in velvet and gold. But something kept pulling Andrew back to the small container sitting on his desk. He picked it up that evening while Lauren was on the phone with her sister, turning it over in his hands the way he used to examine interesting rocks as a child, searching for something he could not name. The velvet lining inside the box seemed slightly uneven, raised in one corner, as though something had been tucked beneath it. Andrew pressed gently on the fabric and felt paper crinkle under his fingers. He pried up the edge of the lining and found a small folded note hidden in the space beneath, written in Margaret's distinctive handwriting. The note contained only 2 lines. The first was a QR code printed on the paper, small and precise. The second was a message scan. This one you're ready to see the truth. Lauren appeared in the doorway, her phone call finished, and immediately demanded to know what Andrew was doing when he showed her the hidden note. She rolled her eyes with theatrical exasperation. It's probably just sentimental nonsense. She said some old video of your parents' anniversary or something equally boring. Don't waste your time. But Andrew was already reaching for his phone. Something in his mother's words, that phrase about being ready to see the truth, had awakened a curiosity that overrode Lauren's dismissal. He opened his camera app and pointed it at the QR code, watching as his screen loaded a link to a private cloud storage account he had never known existed. The account contained a single video file dated 3 years ago, just 2 months before Margaret died. Andrew pressed play, and his mother's face filled the screen. She was sitting in her favorite chair, the green wingback that had occupied the corner of our living room for 30 years. The lighting was soft afternoon sun filtering through the curtains behind her, and she looked tired but alert, her eyes carrying that sharp intelligence that illness had never quite managed to dim. She was wearing the blue cardigan I had given her for her birthday, the one she said made her feel like herself even when the chemotherapy made her feel like a stranger in her own body. Andrew? She began, her voice steady, despite the slight tremor in her hands. If you're watching this, it means your father had to leave. I prayed this day wouldn't come. I prayed that I was wrong about what I saw. That time would prove my fears unfounded, but I knew it might happen. A mother sees things, even things she wishes she could unsee. She paused, taking a breath that seemed to cost her effort. I saw everything, son. I saw how she looked at your father when she thought no one was watching. I saw the calculations behind her smiles, the way she measured his usefulness, like merchandise on a shelf. And I saw how you chose silence over loyalty, how you stood beside her when you should have stood beside him. That broke my heart more than the cancer ever could. Lauren had moved closer to watch the screen over Andrew's shoulder, her expression shifting from boredom to something harder. As Margaret's words continued, I left something with Evelyn Brooks. You remember, Evelyn, the attorney I used to work with at the hospital. She'll contact your father when the time is right, when he needs to understand what I've arranged, everything I built. Andrew, the house, the trust, the investments your father never knew about. None of it was for you to inherit. It was for you to earn. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her gaze seeming to penetrate through the screen. And across the years, you haven't earned it yet. Maybe you never will. But your father deserved protection from people who would use him, even if one of those people turned out to be his own son. I hope you prove me wrong someday. I hope you find your way back to the man I raised, but until then, the safety net belongs to him, not you. The video ended, Margaret's face freezing for a moment. Before the screen went dark, Andrew sat motionless in his chair, the phone trembling slightly in his grip, unable to process what he had just heard. His mother had known she had seen through Lauren's performance years ago, had watched their marriage with clear eyes. While he convinced himself that everything was fine behind him, Lauren's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor, red liquid spreading across the wood like a stain. Neither of them moved to clean it up. What does she mean? Everything she built. Lauren whispered, her voice stripped of its usual confidence, revealing something raw and frightened beneath. What exactly did your mother leave behind? Andrew had no answer. He was still staring at the blank screen, seeing his mother's face, hearing her words about earning what he had always assumed would simply be given, the house they lived, in the life they had constructed on foundations he never questioned. All of it suddenly felt unstable, built on ground that might shift at any moment. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, nestled among the bare winter trees, with smoke already rising from the chimney of the neighboring property. I'd called ahead to have the caretaker turn on the heat and stock the refrigerator with basics. And when I stepped inside, the familiar smell of pine and old books wrapped around me like an embrace from the past. Margaret and I had spent our honeymoon in this cabin 44 years ago. Two young people with no money and endless hope. cooking simple meals on the wood stove, and watching the lake freeze over through windows, fogged with our breath. I set my suitcase on the bed we had once shared and sat down heavily. The exhaustion of the drive and the weight of the past 2 days finally catching up with me. Margaret's envelope was still in my coat pocket, still sealed, still waiting. I was not ready to open it yet. I needed time to think, time to let the silence of this place work its way into my bones before I confronted whatever truths my wife had left behind. I had been there only 3 hours when the knock came at the door. The woman standing on my porch was in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp eyes that assessed me quickly before softening into something like compassion. She wore a heavy coat against the December cold and carried a leather briefcase that looked well used and professional. "Arthur," she said, and her voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. "I'm Evelyn Brooks. Margaret told me you'd come here. She made me promise to wait until you were ready." I recognized the name immediately. Evelyn had been Margaret's colleague at the hospital administration office before she left to become an estate attorney. They had remained close friends for years, meeting for lunch monthly, talking on the phone, late at night about things Margaret never shared with me. I'd always assumed their conversations were about work gossip or shared memories. Now I understood they had been about something far more significant. I invited her inside and made coffee while she settled into the chair by the window. The same chair Margaret used to occupy when we visited together. Evelyn waited until I was seated across from her before opening her briefcase and removing a thick folder of documents. Margaret contacted me about 6 months before she passed. Evelyn began she knew the cancer was terminal, and she wanted to make certain arrangements, while she still had the clarity to do so. What I'm about to tell you, Arthur, she kept secret for your protection. She knew you would have objected, would have insisted on fairness and family unity, but Margaret saw things you didn't want to see. And she acted accordingly. She opened the folder and showed me the first document, a trust agreement dated 3 years ago with Margaret's signature. At the bottom, your wife created an irrevocable trust using inheritance money from her own family funds that were never commingled with your marital assets. This trust owns the house. Where Andrew and Lauren currently live, they don't own it. Arthur, they never have the property is leased to them for $1 per year, a nominal arrangement that can be terminated under specific conditions. I stared at the papers, trying to process what I was hearing. The house I had helped Andrew with the down payment on the home where my grandchildren would have been raised if Andrew and Lauren had ever decided to have children. None of it belonged to them at all. Margaret had maintained control from behind the curtain, watching and waiting. What conditions, I asked Evelyn, turned to another page and pointed to a highlighted paragraph. The trust contains a protective clause. If you, Arthur Bennett, are ever displaced, mistreated, or denied dignity by the beneficiaries of this lease, I have the authority as trustee to terminate the arrangement with 60 days' notice and reclaim the property Margaret wanted you, protected even if that protection had to come from beyond the grave. The room felt very quiet. I could hear the wind moving through the trees outside the creak of the old cabin settling around us. Margaret had built a fortress around me without my knowledge. A legal structure designed to catch me if I fell, there's more. Evelyn said, her voice gentler now. Margaret suspected that Lauren's intentions went beyond simple unkindness. 3 months before she died, Margaret arranged a private conversation with your daughter-in-law. She told Lauren that she wanted to leave the house to Andrew outright, but that you were blocking the transfer for financial reasons. It was a test. Arthur, Margaret wanted to see how Lauren would respond when she thought the obstacle to her inheritance was you, and how did she respond? Evelyn reached into her briefcase and withdrew a small USB drive, placing it on the table between us. Margaret recorded the conversation. Lauren's response was revealing. You need to hear it yourself. But I want to prepare you what Lauren said about you, about your place in the family, about what she planned for your future. It's not easy to listen to. I took the USB drive and held it in my palm, feeling its weight, like something far heavier than plastic and metal. There's something else, Evelyn said quietly, leaning forward. Margaret suspected Lauren was using more than just words to take what wasn't hers. In her final week, she became convinced that some kind of financial deception was being planned, something involving documents and signatures. She told me to tell you when the time came to follow the signature. Those were her exact words. I didn't understand what she meant, but she said, "You would follow the signature." The phrase echoed in my mind, connecting to something I had almost forgotten. Andrew's handwriting had always looked identical to my own, a quirk of genetics or imitation that Margaret had noticed years ago. She had scolded him once for signing my name on a permission slip, warning him that such habits could lead to serious trouble someday. Margaret had seen something I had missed. She had been watching, waiting, building her case, like the meticulous administrator she had always been. And now, from wherever she was handing me the tools to uncover whatever truth she had suspected, but could not prove. The events that unfolded at Andrew's house during those same days reached me later, through multiple sources, fragments of truth, assembled into a picture that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. Some details came from Andrew himself during our eventual confrontation. Others came from Patricia Lauren's own mother, who would prove to be an unexpected ally in the weeks ahead. But at the time, sitting in my cabin, with Evelyn's revelations still echoing in my mind, I had no idea that Margaret's warning about signatures was about to prove devastatingly accurate. The letter arrived at Andrew's house on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail that required a signature. Andrew signed for it without thinking, assuming it was related to the house or some routine financial matter he did not recognize. The bank's name on the return address did not connect it to anything in his carefully compartmentalized life until he tore open the envelope and read the words printed in bold across the top of the page. Final notice guarantor payment required. The letter detailed an auto loan for $85. RO0 financed 8 months earlier for the purchase of a white BMW sedan. The primary borrowers were listed as Patricia and Gerald Simmons, Lauren's parents. But it was the guarantor section that made Andrew's hands begin to shake. There, printed clearly beneath the terms of repayment, was my name, Arthur Bennett, co-signer and personal guarantor for the full amount of the loan. I had never signed any such document. I had never agreed to guarantee any loan. I had not even known the BMW was financed until I saw the bank notification on Lauren's phone the night I left. And yet there was my name attached to a debt I had never consented to, making me legally responsible for a luxury vehicle I would never drive. Andrew found Lauren in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone with the casual disinterest she brought to everything that did not directly serve her ambitions. He threw the letter on the counter in front of her and demanded an explanation, his voice rising in a way it rarely did, cracking with a fear that had been building since the moment he watched his mother's video message. Lauren's composure crumbled faster than Andrew expected. She had been holding too many secrets for too long, and the pressure of the past week had worn her defenses thin. She broke down in a rush of words and tears, the careful architecture of her deceptions collapsing into confession. "I told you to sign it," she shouted, her voice ragged with desperation. 8 months ago, remember? I told you your father had agreed to help my parents with the car, that he'd given verbal approval, but didn't want to deal with the paperwork. You signed his name because I asked you to. Your handwriting looks exactly like his. You've done it before. I didn't think anyone would actually check." Andrew stared at his wife as though seeing her for the first time. The memory surfaced, slowly, reluctantly. A moment he had tried to bury beneath layers of rationalization and willful forgetting Lauren had come to him with the loan documents spread across the dining table, explaining that I had offered to help her parents, but found the paperwork confusing and tedious. She suggested Andrew simply sign on my behalf a small favor that would save everyone time and trouble. He's old. She had said, her voice sweet and reasonable. He won't even remember agreeing to it, and your signatures are practically identical anyway. It's not like anyone will ever know. Andrew had hesitated, some small voice in his conscience, warning him that what she was asking crossed a line he should not cross. But Lauren had kissed him and called him her hero and reminded him how much easier their lives would be if her parents were happy. And so he had picked up the pen and written my name in the space marked for guarantor, betraying me with a single stroke of ink to avoid the discomfort of an argument. The phone rang while they were still standing in the kitchen. Lauren's tears drying on her cheeks as the reality of their situation began to settle. It was Patricia, and her voice carried a fury that transcended the usual tensions between mother and daughter. "You put my name on a fraudulent loan." Patricia screamed loud enough for Andrew to hear across the room. "The bank just called me Lauren. They said I'm listed as secondary guarantor on a document I never signed. Do you understand what you've done? This is criminal. This is fraud. You used your own mother's identity without permission." Lauren tried to explain, tried to spin some story about miscommunication and innocent mistakes. But Patricia was not listening. She hung up with a promise to get to the bottom of this that sounded more like a threat than a reassurance. That evening, Andrew sat alone in the dark living room, the bank letter crumpled in his hands. The sounds of Lauren crying in the bedroom above him filtering through the ceiling like distant rain. He had committed forgery to please his wife. He had signed my name to a document that made me responsible for $85. $0 of debt I never agreed to carry. He had betrayed his father not out of malice but out of weakness. The same weakness that had allowed him to stand silent while Lauren diminished me year after year, and somewhere out there driving toward a cabin by the lake, or perhaps already arrived, his father had Margaret's wedding ring, Margaret's secrets, Margaret's carefully constructed legal protections. Andrew thought about his mother's video message, her words about earning what he had always assumed would simply be given. He thought about the phrase Evelyn had surely delivered by now, the instruction Margaret had left behind. Follow the signature his mother had known somehow, impossibly. Margaret had suspected this exact betrayal before it even happened. And now Andrew realized with sickening clarity that whatever proof existed of what he had done, whatever documents might surface to expose his crime, Margaret had probably already arranged for them to find their way into the right hands. The knock came. 3 days after Evelyn's visit, just as the winter sun was beginning its early descent toward the frozen lake, I had spent those days in a kind of suspended animation, listening to Margaret's recording of Lauren multiple times, each replay revealing new layers of contempt in my daughter-in-law's voice that I had somehow failed to hear during all those years of family dinners and holiday gatherings. I was not ready for visitors, not prepared to face anyone from the life I had left behind. But when I opened the door and saw Patricia Simmons standing on my porch, I understood immediately that this was not a social call. Lauren's mother looked like she had aged a decade since Christmas. Her eyes were red-rimmed and shadowed with exhaustion. Her usually immaculate hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Her expensive coat wrinkled as though she had slept in it. During the 3-hour drive from the city, she carried a manila folder pressed against her chest like armor, and when she spoke, her voice trembled. With something between fear and resignation, "Mr. Bennett," she said, "I'm not here to defend my daughter. I'm here to protect myself." "May I come in?" I stepped aside and let her enter, watching as she surveyed the modest cabin with eyes that probably found it disappointing compared to the lifestyle she had cultivated. But she made no comment about the worn furniture or the outdated kitchen. She simply sat down at the table by the window and placed her folder in front of her, her hands flat on either side of it, as though steadying herself for what came next. I had no idea what Lauren did with that loan. Patricia began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. She used my identity without permission. She forged my signature as secondary guarantor on a document I never saw, never agreed to, never would have approved when the bank called me. I thought there had been some mistake. Then I realized the only mistake was trusting my own daughter. I sat across from her and said nothing, giving her the space to continue. I had learned long ago that silence often extracted more truth than questions. Patricia's composure cracked slowly, like ice breaking apart in spring. This isn't the first time she admitted her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 5 years ago, Lauren opened a credit card in my name. She ran up $12,000 in charges before I discovered it. Designer clothes, expensive dinners, a weekend trip to Miami with friends. When I confronted her, she cried and apologized and promised it would never happen again. She said she was under financial pressure, that Andrew's salary wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle they needed for his career. She laughed bitterly at her own words. I covered it up. I paid off the debt and closed the account, and never told anyone, not even my husband. I couldn't bear the scandal. Couldn't stand the thought of people knowing what my daughter had done, but I kept records. Mr. Bennett bank statements, the fraudulent application with her handwriting, everything. I told myself it was insurance, just in case I never thought I would actually need it. Patricia opened the folder and pushed it across the table toward me. Inside were photocopies of credit card statements, a loan application with signatures I now recognized as forgeries, and a handwritten letter from Lauren promising to never repeat her mistakes. The documentation was thorough, the kind of evidence that would establish a clear pattern of behavior if it ever came. Before a judge, I raised her to be ambitious. Patricia said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I wanted her to have everything I didn't have. Growing up, I taught her that success mattered, that appearances mattered, that you had to fight for your place in the world. But somewhere along the way, she learned that ambition means taking from others. She learned that people are tools to be used and discarded, and I don't know how to undo what I created. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that seemed almost childlike in its vulnerability. I can't protect her anymore. Not from this, what she did to you, what she convinced Andrew to do. It's beyond anything I can excuse or cover up. But I'm asking you, Mr. Bennett, please don't destroy Andrew completely. He's weak. I know that he let Lauren reshape him into something smaller than he was meant to be, but I don't think he's evil. I think he just married the wrong person and never found the courage to admit it. I looked at the folder in front of me, pages filled with evidence of deception, stretching back years. This woman had driven 3 hours through winter weather to hand me weapons against her own daughter, not out of loyalty to me, but out of self-preservation, and perhaps some buried sense of justice she had tried to ignore for too long. Why are you really here, Patricia? I asked quietly. She met my eyes for the first time since sitting down. Because Lauren called me yesterday. She's not giving up. She's already talking to lawyers, trying to find ways to claim that you're mentally incompetent, that you abandoned your family, that any documents Margaret left behind were created under duress or confusion. She's going to fight dirty, Mr. Bennett. It's the only way she knows how to fight. Patricia stood and buttoned her coat, preparing to leave at the door. She paused and looked back at me with an expression I could not quite read. Lauren's already planning something, she said. I don't know exactly what, but I know my daughter. She's not going to let. You win quietly whatever you're going to do. Do it soon and do it carefully. I watched from the porch as her car disappeared down the snow-covered road, the folder of documents heavy in my hands. The evidence Patricia had given me could destroy Lauren's credibility in any legal proceeding. could establish her as a serial fraudster whose word meant nothing, combined with what Evelyn had provided, I now had enough ammunition to dismantle my daughter-in-law's entire carefully constructed life. But it was not the folder that kept me awake that night, staring at the ceiling, while the wind howled across the frozen lake. It was Patricia's warning echoing in my mind, the certainty in her voice, when she spoke about her daughter's capacity for manipulation. Lauren was not finished. She was regrouping, strategizing, preparing her next move in a game I had never wanted to play. The USB drive sat on the kitchen table for 2 days after Patricia left small and innocuous and terrifying in its implications. I knew what it contained. Evelyn had told me about Margaret's test about the conversation she had engineered with Lauren to reveal truths that politeness and family loyalty had kept hidden. But knowing something exists and actually confronting it are different acts entirely, and I found myself circling the drive like a man approaching a wound he was not yet ready to examine on the third evening, with snow falling softly outside and the fire crackling in the old stone hearth. I finally inserted the drive into my laptop and pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the cabin, and for a moment I could not breathe. It had been 3 years since I heard her speak. 3 years of silence, broken only by memories that grew fainter with each passing month. But here she was, preserved in digital clarity, her tone warm and conversational, as she set the trap that would expose my daughter-in-law's true nature, Lauren. "I wanted to talk to you privately about something important," Margaret began. "I've been thinking about the house, about what happens to it after I'm gone. I want to leave it to Andrew outright. No conditions, no complications, but Arthur keeps blocking me. He thinks you're only after our money, that you don't really care about Andrew or our family. I've tried to convince him otherwise, but you know how stubborn he can be." There was a pause on the recording, and I could imagine Lauren's face shifting as she calculated her response, weighing how much honesty she could risk with a dying woman who might be offering her everything she wanted. Then Lauren's voice came through the speakers, and the mask she wore in my presence fell away completely. "Well, Margaret, I appreciate you being honest with me. And since we're being honest, maybe Arthur should remember who'll be choosing his nursing home someday. Old people shouldn't make enemies of the young. If he keeps standing in the way of Andrew's inheritance, he might find his golden years a lot less comfortable than he's planning." The words hung in the air of my cabin, spoken years ago, but landing fresh and sharp as broken glass. Lauren had threatened me to my dying wife's face, had made clear that my future comfort and dignity depended on my cooperation with her plans. She had not even bothered to soften the message with false affection or family sentiment. She had simply stated her position as though discussing a business negotiation. Margaret's reply came after a brief pause. Her voice calm and measured in a way I recognized from our decades together. It was the tone she used when she had learned everything she needed to know. "Thank you, Lauren. You've told me everything I needed to know." The recording ended. I sat in the silence that followed the laptop screen, glowing in the darkening cabin, and I didn't move for a very long time outside. The snow continued to fall. The fire burned down to embers. The winter night pressed against the windows like something waiting to be LED in. Margaret had seen everything. She had understood what Lauren was years before I allowed myself to recognize it, had watched our daughter-in-law calculate and manipulate and scheme while I made excuses and looked the other way. And rather than burden me with knowledge that would have torn our family apart while she was still alive, Margaret had quietly built her defenses, constructed her legal fortresses, arranged her evidence like a general preparing for a war. She knew would come after she was gone. She had not just loved me, she had protected me from beyond the grave. When I finally moved again, my joints stiff from hours of stillness, I reached for the sealed envelope I'd carried from Andrew's house. Margaret's handwriting on the front seemed to glow in the firelight. my name written in her careful script. I'd been waiting for the right moment to open it, and now I understood that this was the moment she had intended. All along, inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Margaret's familiar handwriting. I read her words slowly, hearing her voice in every line. Arthur, by now. You've heard the recording by now. You've learned about the trust, about the house, about the protections I put in place. Without telling you, I'm sorry for the secrets. I'm sorry I couldn't share this burden while I was alive. But there's one more thing you don't know. The real reason I never let Andrew have the house, the reason I kept it in my family's trust, even when you asked me to transfer it as a wedding gift. Look at page 47 of our original trust document. The answer is there. And I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner I love you. Always page 47 of the trust document contained a clause I had never noticed during all the years Margaret and I reviewed our estate planning together. It specified that if any beneficiary or their spouse engaged in financial fraud, forgery, or identity theft against a family member, their rights under the trust would be automatically suspended. Pending investigation, Margaret had inserted this provision quietly without discussion years before Lauren ever signed my name. To a document I had never seen, my wife had not merely suspected what might happen, she had prepared for it with the precision of an engineer designing fail-safes into a bridge. I called Evelyn that same night and told her everything. The forged loan documents, Patricia's visit, the pattern of fraud stretching back years. Evelyn listened without interruption, then said the words I had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. I'll send the notice tomorrow. 60 days to vacate. The letter arrived at Andrew's house by certified mail. 3 days later, I was not there to witness Lauren's reaction, but Evelyn described it to me afterward based on what Andrew eventually confessed. Lauren had torn open the envelope expecting some routine correspondence, perhaps another bank statement or utility bill. Instead, she found herself holding official notification that the Margaret Ellis Bennett Family Trust was invoking its protective clause, requiring all current occupants to vacate the property within 60 days. Her screaming could be heard throughout the house. She threw the letter at Andrew, then threw a vase. Then threw accusations that echoed off the walls of the home she had always assumed would be hers forever. Do something, she shrieked at her husband. Call your father, beg him, get on your knees if you have to fix this. But Andrew had no idea how to fix something. This broken, he had spent his entire marriage following Lauren's lead, trusting her judgment, signing whatever she placed in front of him. Now the foundation of that trust had crumbled, and he stood in the wreckage without any tools to rebuild. The bank's letter arrived 2 days after Evelyn's notice, without a valid guarantor payment. They were initiating repossession proceedings for the BMW. More troubling was the second paragraph, which noted that preliminary review of the loan documents had revealed irregularities in the guarantor signatures. The matter was being referred to their fraud investigation unit, with potential criminal referral to follow. The BMW that had gleamed so proudly in her parents' driveway on Christmas Eve was returned within the week. Patricia and Gerald Simmons drove it back themselves, parking it in Andrew and Lauren's driveway and leaving the keys on the front porch without knocking. Gerald left a note for Andrew, handwritten on his personal stationery. Our daughter has a problem. We've made excuses for her behavior for too long, and we won't be complicit in it anymore. Whatever happens next, she'll have to face it without our support. We're sorry it came to this. Take care of yourself. Lauren's parents cut ties with their own daughter over the shame of a car. She had tried to give them. The irony was not lost on me when Patricia called to tell me what they had done. The gift meant to demonstrate Lauren's success had become the instrument of her exposure in the weeks that followed. I heard from multiple sources that Lauren was not accepting defeat. She had entered a manic phase of planning, convinced that the right strategy could still salvage everything. Her solution was a family reconciliation dinner, an event she would orchestrate to bring everyone together and smooth over what she insisted on calling misunderstandings. She sent invitations to Andrew's extended family, to her own parents, despite their rejection, and even to me through Evelyn's office. The invitation was beautifully printed on expensive cardstock, requesting the pleasure of our company at a gathering meant to heal wounds and restore family unity. Lauren smiled as she addressed those envelopes, believing that her powers of persuasion remained intact. She had talked her way out of trouble before she had manipulated situations far more delicate than this. The right words. At the right moment, a few carefully timed tears, a performance of vulnerability and remorse. These tools had never failed her. What she did not know was that Patricia had already called me to discuss the invitation. What she did not know was that Evelyn and I had spent hours preparing documentation that would answer any lie. Lauren might tell what she did not know was that 3 of the people she had invited had already spoken to each other, comparing notes and coordinating our responses. We were coming to her dinner, but not to reconcile. We were coming to witness the final collapse of a performance that had run far too long. The day before Lauren's reconciliation dinner, I heard tires crunching on the frozen gravel outside my cabin. I'd been sitting on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in the old wool blanket Margaret used to drape over both of us during our winter visits here, watching the late afternoon light play across the frozen surface of the lake. I knew the sound of Andrew's car, the way a parent knows their child's footsteps, and I did not turn around. When he climbed out and walked toward me, he stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a long moment, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. He looked older than he had at Christmas, the weeks of crisis having carved new lines into his face and stolen the easy confidence he had worn like a costume for so long. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. "Dad, I need to talk to you." I gestured to the empty chair beside me, the one Margaret had claimed as hers. During all those years of watching sunsets together, Andrew climbed the steps slowly and sat down, his eyes fixed on the lake, as though he could not bear to look at me directly. We sat in silence for several minutes. I had learned patience from 40 years of engineering work, from waiting for concrete to cure and steel to settle, from understanding that some processes cannot be rushed without compromising the integrity of the final structure. Andrew had come here to say something, and I would give him the space to find his words. "I know about the trust," he finally said. "I know about Mom's video. I know about the recording. With Lauren, Evelyn sent me copies of everything." I nodded but did not respond. There was more coming, and we both knew it. I didn't know. Andrew continued, his voice cracking, about the house, about Mom's plans, about any of it. "She never told me. I thought the house was ours. I thought everything was just normal family stuff, parents helping their kids, nothing complicated." I reached into my coat pocket and withdrew the document I had been carrying since Patricia's visit. It was a photocopy of the BMW loan agreement with the guarantor signature section highlighted in yellow. I unfolded it slowly and held it out to my son. "Did you write this?" Andrew stared at the paper, at the signature that bore my name in handwriting that was almost but not quite my own. His silence stretched across seconds that felt like hours, and in that silence I heard his confession more clearly than any words could have spoken it. "Lauren said you had agreed," he whispered. "She said you wanted to help her parents, but didn't want to deal with the paperwork. She said it was just a formality, that no one would ever check, that your signatures look so similar anyway that it didn't really matter." Did you believe that? He finally looked at me, and I saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. I wanted to believe it. It was easier than asking questions. It was easier than fighting with her. I folded the document and returned it to my pocket. The lake stretched before us, gray, and still the ice thick enough now to walk across. If anyone were foolish enough to try, I could forgive you for being weak, I said, measuring each word carefully. I spent years watching you defer to her, watching you shrink yourself to fit the shape she wanted that hurt me. But I understood it. Marriage is complicated and love makes cowards of us all. Sometimes I could even forgive you for choosing her over me, for standing beside her while she treated me like an inconvenience to be managed. Parents expect to be set aside eventually. It's the natural order of things. Andrew's tears were falling freely now, freezing on his cheeks in the bitter cold. But you signed my name, Andrew. You took a pen and wrote my signature on a legal document that made me responsible for 85 odd loss. 00. I never agreed to owe you, made me complicit in fraud without my knowledge, without my consent. That wasn't weakness. That was betrayal. The word landed between us like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that could never be taken back. Dad, I'm sorry. Andrew sobbed. I'm so sorry. I didn't think about what it meant. I just wanted Lauren to stop pushing, stop arguing, stop making everything so hard. I took the easy path, and I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway. He reached for my hand, but I didn't take his. Not yet. Not until I had said what needed to be said. I don't want your apology. Andrew, apologies are easy. They cost nothing and they change nothing. What I want is for you to choose. He looked at me with desperate confusion. Tomorrow at that dinner? Lauren is planning. You have a choice to make. You can stand up in front of everyone she's invited and tell the truth. All of it. The signature, the lies, the years of watching her treat your father like dirt beneath her designer shoes. You can finally be honest about who she is and what you've allowed yourself to become. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle fully, or you can stay silent and let her perform her way out of this. You can stand beside her one more time while she manipulates everyone in that room. But if you choose that path, Andrew, you lose me forever. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, just out of the simple fact that I cannot keep loving someone who refuses to be lovable. Andrew drove away an hour later, my words hanging in the air between us like smoke that would not clear. I watched his tail lights disappear down the road and wondered which choice he would make. Wondered if I had asked too much or not enough. Wondered if Margaret would have handled this moment differently. What I could not see was Andrew pulling into his own driveway as darkness fell, looking through the window at Lauren laughing on the phone, still confident, still believing she controlled the narrative of their lives I could not see. The realization crossing his face as he sat in his cold car, understanding finally that he had already lost something far more valuable than a house or a marriage or a carefully constructed image of success. He had lost the man his mother raised him to be. And tomorrow he would have to decide if that man was worth finding again. Lauren had chosen a private room at one of the finest restaurants in the city for her reconciliation. Dinner, a space with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the winter skyline. She told Andrew she wanted somewhere neutral, a place where everyone could feel comfortable and conversations could flow without the weight of family history pressing down on them. But I understood her real motivation the moment I walked through the door and saw the crowd she had assembled. This was not a private family gathering. This was a performance, and she had invited an audience. I arrived deliberately late, timing my entrance to occur after the cocktail hour, but before the main event, the room was already full of people I barely recognized, distant cousins I had not seen since Margaret's funeral, neighbors from Andrew Street, and several well-dressed strangers who turned out to be Lauren's professional contacts from her marketing firm. She had stacked the room with witnesses, people who would see her gracious hospitality and hear her carefully crafted narrative before I had a chance to offer any alternative version of events. I found a seat at a small table in the corner, as far from the main gathering as possible, and watched the room, with the patience Margaret had always admired in me. A waiter brought me water without being asked, and I sipped it slowly while Lauren worked the crowd like a politician, at a fundraiser, touching arms and laughing at jokes, and radiating the warm sincerity that had fooled me for so many years. Patricia and her husband Gerald arrived shortly after I did, entering through the main door with expressions that suggested they would rather be anywhere else. Lauren moved toward them immediately, arms outstretched for an embrace. But Patricia sidestepped the gesture and guided Gerald to a table on the opposite side of the room. They sat with their backs to their daughter, a positioning that spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. Andrew stood near the bar, a drink in his hand, that he had not touched, his eyes darting between his phone and the entrance, as though expecting someone else to arrive. Sweat glistened on his forehead. Despite the room's careful climate control, he had not spoken to me since leaving the cabin, had not called or texted to indicate what choice he had made. I watched him and wondered if he had found the courage I had demanded or if weakness would win. Once again, Evelyn arrived, last slipping through a side entrance and positioning herself near the exit with the quiet efficiency of someone who had attended many difficult meetings in her career. She caught my eye across the room and nodded once, a small gesture of solidarity that steadied something in my chest at precisely 7:30. Lauren stepped onto a small raised platform at the front of the room and picked up a microphone. The chatter died down as guests turned their attention to their hostess, drinks still in hand, faces expectant and sympathetic. "Thank you all for coming tonight." Lauren began, her voice warm and trembling with rehearsed emotion. "I know this has been a difficult time for our family. There have been misunderstandings, confusion, and a lot of pain. My father-in-law, Arthur, has been going through a challenging period since losing his wife. And sometimes grief can make us see things that aren't there, believe things that aren't true." She paused to dab at her eyes with the tissue she had strategically tucked into her sleeve. "I love Arthur. I have always loved him. As the father I never had when Andrew and I got married, I promised myself I would honor his parents the way I would honor my own, and it breaks my heart that recent events have created distance between us." Murmurs of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Several guests shot pitying glances in my direction. The confused old man who had caused so much trouble for this gracious young woman tonight is about healing. Lauren continued, her voice gaining strength. Tonight is about setting aside accusations and assumptions and remembering that we are family. I hope we can move forward together with love and understanding and forgiveness. The applause was generous, the kind of response people give when they want to believe they are witnessing something noble. Lauren smiled through her tears and scanned the room until her eyes found mine. The triumph in her expression was unmistakable, a predator's satisfaction at having cornered prey that could no longer escape Dad, she said sweetly, the microphone amplifying her voice across the silent room. "Would you like to say a few words? I'm sure everyone would love to hear from you." I rose slowly from my chair, feeling every eye in the room turned toward me. The walk to the front seemed longer than it should have, each step carrying the weight of everything I had learned over the past weeks, every betrayal and every protection Margaret had built around me. But before I could reach the microphone, before I could say any of the words I had prepared, another voice cut through the silence. It came from the back of the room, clear and steady, and filled with a resolve that made Lauren's carefully composed face go pale. "Actually, I'd like to speak first." It was Patricia, Lauren's own mother, rising from her seat with a folder clutched in her hands and an expression that promised no mercy. Patricia walked toward the front of the room with the measured pace of someone who had made peace with what she was about to do. The folder in her hands seemed ordinary, just manila paper and metal clasp, But I knew what it contained. I had seen those documents spread across my kitchen table at the cabin. I had studied the evidence of a daughter's betrayal, compiled by her own mother. Lauren's smile faltered as Patricia approached the platform. "Mom, what are you doing? Sit down." This isn't the time, but Patricia did not sit down. She climbed the 2 steps to stand beside her daughter, then gently but firmly took the microphone from Lauren's hand. The room had gone completely silent, and guests frozen with drinks halfway to their lips, sensing that the evening had veered sharply from its scripted course. Before my son-in-law speaks, Patricia said, her voice steady, despite the slight tremor in her hands. "I have something to say about my daughter." Lauren reached for the microphone, but Patricia stepped back, putting distance between them. Gerald remained seated at their table, his head bowed, unwilling or unable to watch what was about to unfold. Many of you know Lauren as a successful professional, a devoted wife, a charming hostess. I raised her to be all those things. What I failed to teach her was where ambition ends and exploitation begins. Patricia opened the folder and removed the first document, holding it up for the room to see 8 months ago. My daughter arranged for a car loan in my name without my knowledge or consent. She forged my signature as secondary guarantor on an $85,000 debt when the bank called me about missed payments. I discovered that my own child had committed identity fraud against me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lauren's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: shock to anger to the beginning of tears. Her instinct searching for the right performance to regain control. "Mom, please," Lauren said, her voice cracking with practiced vulnerability. "You're confused. We talked about this." I explained the misunderstanding. Patricia continued as though Lauren had not spoken. "This was not the first time 5 years ago Lauren opened a credit card in my name and accumulated $12,000 in fraudulent charges. I discovered it, confronted her, and she promised it would never happen again. I covered for her. Then I paid off the debt and kept her secret, because I was ashamed to admit what my daughter had become." She removed more papers from the folder, spreading them across the podium like exhibits in a trial. "But I kept records, bank statements, the original fraudulent application, in her handwriting, a written apology where she admitted what she had done. I kept everything because somewhere in my heart I knew this moment would come. I knew eventually the lies would pile too high to ignore Lauren. Abandoned her tears and tried a different approach, laughing dismissively. This is ridiculous. My mother is clearly having some kind of episode. Someone should call her doctor." Patricia's expression hardened. "I am more lucid than I have been in years. Lauren and I'm done protecting you from the consequences of your choices. You used everyone in this room. You used me. You used your father. You used Andrew, and you used that man over there?" She pointed directly at me. "Arthur Bennett did nothing wrong except trust his son and try to be part of a family that never deserved him. The confusion and mental decline you've been hinting at in your little speech. Fabrications, the misunderstandings you want everyone to forgive. They were deliberate deceptions designed to steal what wasn't yours. Movement near the bar caught my attention." Andrew had risen from his seat, his face pale and slick with sweat, his hands shaking as he stepped forward into the open space between the tables. "My mother is right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying in the absolute silence of the room about all of it. Lawrence spun toward her husband. "Andrew, shut up. Don't say another word." But Andrew continued, his eyes fixed on me across the room. "I signed my father's name on those loan documents. Lauren told me Dad had agreed to it verbally, that I was just saving him the trouble of paperwork. She said our signatures looked similar enough that no one would ever check, and I believed her because believing her was easier than questioning her." He took a shaky breath. "I committed forgery against my own father. I was too weak and too desperate to keep the peace, to recognize what I was doing. Dad, I'm sorry in front of everyone here. I'm sorry for all of it. for the signature. For the years of letting Lauren treat you like you didn't matter for choosing her over you, every single time. The room remained frozen, guests, uncertain how to react to a confession none of them had expected. Lauren stood alone on the platform. Now Patricia, having stepped aside the microphone abandoned on the podium, her carefully constructed evening lay in ruins around her, and I watched as the mask finally cracked beyond repair. This is insane. Lauren screamed, her voice losing all pretense of grace. You're all insane. Everything I did for this family, I did for us. Do you think any of you would have anything without me? Andrew was nothing when I met him, nothing, a boring accountant with no ambition, and a father who thought retirement meant giving up on life. She pointed at Patricia. You covered for me because you were embarrassed to have a daughter smarter than you, and you... She swung toward me, her eyes blazing with fury. You should have died years ago. Everyone would have been better off if you just followed your precious Margaret into the ground. The silence that followed was absolute. Lauren stood panting in the center of the room, surrounded by people who were seeing her clearly. For the first time, her parents would not meet her eyes. Andrew had stepped away from her, physically distancing himself from the woman he had married. The neighbors and colleagues she had invited as witnesses to her triumph were now witnesses to something else entirely. Then Lauren looked at me, searching my face for some reaction, some sign that her words had wounded me the way she intended, but I had not spoken a single word since entering this room. I had not. Needed to Margaret's revenge was never about destruction or humiliation. It was simply about letting the truth speak for itself. And the truth had spoken more eloquently than anything I could have added. 1 month after the dinner, I sat in Evelyn's office watching winter sunlight stream through windows that overlooked a quiet street. In town, the folder on her desk contained everything needed to pursue criminal charges against Lauren and Andrew. Documentation of forgery and fraud and identity theft that would likely result in convictions and possible prison time. Evelyn had assembled the case with meticulous precision, the same care she had brought to protecting Margaret's wishes for so many years. The district attorney's office has reviewed the materials. Evelyn said they're prepared to move forward if you want to proceed, given the evidence, Patricia's willingness to testify, and Andrew's confession at the dinner convictions are virtually certain. I looked at the folder for a long moment, thinking about everything it represented: justice, certainly vindication for the years of disrespect and the crime committed against my name. A clear message that actions have consequences and that even family cannot escape accountability for betrayal. But I also thought about Margaret, about the woman who had built these protections, not as weapons but as shields. She had never wanted destruction. She had wanted truth. And truth had been achieved in that restaurant, when Lauren's mask shattered and Andrew finally found his voice. No, I said quietly. I won't be pressing charges. Evelyn's eyebrows rose. The first genuine surprise I'd seen from her in all our dealings. Arthur, are you certain after everything they did, destroying them won't bring Margaret back? It won't restore the years I spent being diminished in my own son's house. All it would do is give me a front row seat to more suffering, and I've seen enough suffering to last several lifetimes. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the bear. Trees lining the street. I wanted them to see themselves clearly. That happened. Lauren stood in a room full of people she had tried to impress and watched her entire performance collapse. Andrew admitted his crime in front of witnesses and will carry that confession for the rest of his life. Those consequences are real. Evelyn prison would just be punishment. What they experienced was something harder. It was recognition. Evelyn studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Margaret always said you were the more forgiving one. She built all these structures precisely because she knew you wouldn't use them as weapons. She knew me better than I knew myself. The separation happened quickly. After that, Lauren moved back to her parents' house within 2 weeks of the dinner, but Patricia had learned from her years of enabling, she set strict conditions for her daughter's return mandatory therapy with a specialist in personality disorders, complete financial transparency, and no monetary support beyond basic necessities for the first time in her life. Lauren would have to face consequences without an escape route, without someone willing to cover for her mistakes or fund her recovery. Andrew stayed in the house alone, rattling around the empty rooms like a ghost haunting his own failed life. He called me several times in the weeks that followed, but I was not ready to talk. The wound was still too fresh, the image of my name forged on documents still too vivid in my mind. I needed time, and time was something I finally had in abundance. He drove to the cabin on a gray afternoon in late February, arriving without calling ahead, his car pulling into the driveway. Just as I was returning from a walk along the frozen lake, I watched him climb out and stand uncertainly by his vehicle waiting for permission to approach. He looked thinner than he had at Christmas aged, by the weight of everything that had collapsed since then. "Dad?" He said, "I wanted to thank you for not pressing charges you had every right to. Destroy us both." I gestured for him to follow me inside where I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table that had witnessed so many conversations between Margaret and me over the decades. The silence stretched between us, but it was not entirely uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had run out of pretense and had nothing left but honesty. "I didn't do it for you." I finally said, "I did it for your mother. Margaret believed people could change, but only if they're allowed to survive their mistakes. She built those protections to catch me if I fell, not to destroy you. If you failed, prison would have ended your story. What I want is for you to write a different chapter." Andrew's eyes glistened, but he held back the tears. "I don't know how to do that. I don't know who I am without Lauren telling me." "Then that's the first thing you need to figure out." I reached into a drawer and withdrew papers Evelyn had prepared. At my request, they outlined new terms for Andrew's continued residence in the house, amendments to the trust that would allow him to stay while maintaining Margaret's family ownership of the property. "You can keep living there," I explained, "but the house will never be yours. Not unless you earn it. The trust will review your conduct, annually demonstrated integrity over time. Real change that your mother would have recognized. That's the path to eventual ownership. It might take 5 years. It might take 20. The timeline depends entirely on you." Andrew took the papers and read them slowly, his expression shifting as he absorbed the implications, your mother's final lesson. I said, "Nothing worth having is simply given. It has to be built piece by piece, with your own hands and your own choices. She wanted you to learn that I'm giving you the chance." He signed the documents without hesitation. His hand steady for the first time since arriving. When he finished, he looked at me with something I had not seen in his eyes for years. Something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. I walked him to the door. As the afternoon light faded toward evening, he paused on the porch, his hand on the railing, looking out at the snow-covered lake that held so many of my memories with Margaret Dad. "I know I don't deserve to ask this," he said quietly, "but will I see you at Christmas? I mean, if I'm still trying, if I'm doing better, would you consider coming?" I thought about Margaret, about the 44 years we had shared, and the future she had prepared for me to navigate alone. I thought about the son I had raised and the stranger he had become, and the small spark of the original boy I had glimpsed in his confession at the dinner. The path forward was unclear, but for the first time since leaving Andrew's house on that frozen December morning, I could imagine a path existing at all. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I hope so." 1 year later, I stood in the cabin kitchen, hanging the last of Margaret's ornaments on a small tree. I'd cut myself from the property behind the house, the decorations, were old and worn, some of them dating back to our first Christmas together when we had no money and made ornaments from pine cones and ribbon. Margaret had kept every one of them, adding new pieces over the decades, but never discarding the originals. Now they caught the firelight and cast small shadows across the walls, memories made visible in glass and thread and faded paint. The cabin was warm, despite the December cold outside, the wood stove radiating heat that reached every corner of the modest space I had spent the past year making small improvements, fixing the things that had been neglected during my years of focusing on Andrew's life instead of my own. New insulation in the attic, fresh paint on the porch railings, a repaired dock that would be ready for fishing when the lake thawed in spring. The work had been good for me, physical labor that tired my body and quieted my mind. I heard the car before I saw it, tires crunching on the frozen gravel of the driveway through the window. Watched Andrew climb out and stand for a moment, looking at the cabin, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He was thinner than he had been a year ago. The softness of comfortable living replaced by something leaner and more uncertain. He carried a single gift wrapped in plain brown paper, and he walked toward the porch with the hesitant steps of someone who was not sure of his welcome. I opened the door before he could knock. "Merry Christmas, Dad," he said quietly. "Merry Christmas? Andrew, come inside before you freeze." We sat by the fire with cups of coffee, the wrapped gift resting on the table between us. Andrew told me about the past year, in fragments, not making excuses or seeking sympathy, just sharing the facts of his changed life. The divorce from Lauren had been finalized in September. She had fought it, initially, then accepted it. When Patricia made clear that continued financial support depended on Lauren taking responsibility for her choices last, Andrew heard she was still in therapy, still living with her parents, still struggling to build an identity that did not depend on manipulation. "I've been volunteering," Andrew said, staring into his coffee, "at an elder care facility across town. 3 times a week, I help with activities, read to residents. Just sit with people who don't have anyone else to visit them." He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I had not seen in years. "I wanted to understand what I almost did to you, Dad. What I almost became those people in that facility. Some of them have families who never visit, who treat them like burdens to be managed. I watched the loneliness in their faces, and I realized that's what I was turning you into, an obligation instead of a father." I did not respond immediately. Some confessions need space to breathe before they can be acknowledged. Andrew pushed the wrapped gift across the table toward me. "I made you something. It's not much, and honestly, it's pretty terrible. But I wanted to give you something that actually cost me effort instead of just money." I unwrapped the brown paper carefully and found inside a pair of hand-knitted gloves. They were lumpy and uneven, the stitches irregular. One finger slightly longer than its partner. They were clearly the work of someone who had never held knitting needles before and had struggled through every row. Mom always said the best gifts were the ones people made themselves. Andrew said, his voice thick. "I didn't know how to knit. I had to learn from videos online, and I probably started over a dozen times, but I wanted to give you something that showed I was trying to be different." I slipped the gloves onto my hands. They didn't fit perfectly, too tight in some places and loose in others, but they were warm, made warm, not just by the wool, but by the hours of effort and intention they represented. I looked at my son, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw glimpses of the boy I had raised. The boy who used to sit on my lap asking questions about how things worked. The boy who cried when his pet goldfish died and insisted we hold a funeral in the backyard. The boy who existed before Lauren, before the greed, before the silence that had grown between us like a wall I thought could never be breached. "Thank you," I said. "They're perfect." We moved to the porch. As evening settled over the lake, sitting in the two chairs that had always belonged to Margaret and me, the snow began to fall softly, large flakes, drifting down through the darkness to settle on the frozen water and the bare branches of the trees. We didn't talk much. There would be time for more conversations, more rebuilding, more of the slow work of becoming father and son again. For now, it was enough to simply sit together and watch the snow fall. I touched the lumpy wool of my new gloves and felt something unfamiliar spread through my chest. It took me a moment to recognize it as a smile. My first real smile. In longer than I could remember. Margaret had been right all along, as she had been right. About so many things, the sweetest victories are not won with anger or revenge. They are won simply by surviving long enough to see the truth matter. And finally, after everything, the truth mattered that winter evening on the cabin porch was not an ending, but a beginning. The road ahead for Arthur and Andrew would be long and uncertain, filled with difficult conversations and moments of doubt, and the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding trust that had been shattered. But for the first time in years, they were walking that road together, two men connected by blood and history, and the memory of a woman who had loved them both enough to plan for the worst while hoping for the best. Margaret's legacy was never about money or property or legal documents. It was about truth. The simple, powerful truth that family means nothing without dignity and that love without respect is just another form of captivity. Arthur learned that lesson the hard way through cheap socks and forged signatures and whispered insults he was never meant to hear, but he also learned that survival is its own kind of victory, that walking away can be the bravest choice a person makes, and that sometimes the people who hurt us most are also the ones most capable of change. Lauren faces her own journey, now stripped of the manipulations that defined her for so long, forced to confront the person she became, and decide who she wants to be. Whether she finds redemption or not is a story yet to be written. But Arthur's story has found its ending sitting on a porch with his son wearing imperfect gloves made by imperfect hands, watching snow fall on a lake that holds 44 years of memories. If this story moved you, if you saw pieces of your own family in these struggles, please share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity is worth protecting, and the truth always finds its way to the surface. Leave a comment telling me about a time when you had to stand up for yourself against people who should have loved you better, and subscribe so you never miss another story about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage. Thank you for staying until the end.